The moment I saw my own garage door wide open, with a folding table sticking halfway out and a banner reading, HOA Quarterly Wine and Strategy Summit hanging crookedly above it, I had two immediate thoughts. 1. I never gave anyone permission to enter my garage. 2. The universe had just handed me the dumbest criminals I would ever investigate. They'd broken into a state tax examiner's private property, and were currently sipping Chardonnay 5 feet from stacks of unfiled receipts, forged invoices, and what looked like a massage chair labeled office equipment. I hadn't even unpacked my dishes yet, and already I was sitting on enough tax violations to make a small cult sweat. And the best part? They had no idea who I was. They thought I was just some quiet new guy with a nice smile and a weak spine. They were about to learn that I audit fraud for a living, and that I never let theft slide, especially when it's hidden in plain sight in my own garage. It had only been 4 days since I moved into Oak Hills Estates, a place where the sidewalks were clean, the lawns were aggressively symmetrical, and the neighborhood smiles were stretched a little too tightly over gritted teeth. I had just landed a new position with the State Department of Revenue as one of their lead tax examiners, and after years of apartment hopping and living out of cardboard boxes, I thought this house might be the first place I could call home. Peace, quiet, maybe a few backyard barbecues with people who wouldn't ask too many questions. I kept my job vague when introducing myself. I work in state administration, I said to the first few neighbors who cornered me with suspicious welcome baskets and brochures full of HOA rules printed on high-gloss paper. Karen was the first to really introduce herself, and by introduce, I mean interrogate me about my trash can placement and whether or not I intended to repaint the trim, to better match community standards. She wore oversized sunglasses and carried a clipboard like it was a badge. "We run a tight ship here," she said, gesturing to the community as if she personally built it with her bare hands and a suburban dream. I nodded politely and gave her nothing. I've been trained to observe more than I reveal. That's part of the job. And already she was giving me everything: her attitude, her sense of control, and most of all, her habit of assuming she could do whatever she wanted without consequence. The first real red flag came when I noticed a new padlock on my garage door. I had just finished installing my own lock system the night before, and now it had been swapped out. I tried the garage code. Nothing. My backup key didn't fit. Confused, I went to the side entrance and peeked through the window. That's when I saw it. Long folding tables covered in paperwork, HOA letterhead strewn everywhere, boxes of red and white wine stacked like bricks, and an entire filing cabinet in the corner. Someone had turned my garage into an HOA operations center. Karen appeared behind me like a villain in a Disney Channel movie. "Oh, I meant to leave a note," she said, not even pretending to be sorry. "The previous owner was kind enough to let us store our meeting materials here. It's kind of become tradition." She smiled like she expected me to thank her for violating my property rights. I told her I hadn't agreed to anything, and her smile tightened like a rubber band about to snap. "Well, we assumed you'd be a team player. I've seen people try to manipulate, gaslight, and deflect accountability in every possible way, but there's something especially bold about someone who breaks into your garage and then acts like you're the problem for noticing." I didn't argue. I just nodded and told her I'd look into it. Which, in my line of work, is code for, "I'm about to end your financial career." That night, as I sat down to catch up on work emails, I noticed a new assignment had popped into my inbox. I nearly laughed out loud when I read the subject line: Oak Hills Estates HOA Audit Assignment Confirmed. The state had just randomly assigned me to review the exact HOA that had broken into my garage and was now storing what looked like years' worth of tax and financial documentation in it. I didn't believe in fate until that moment. The next morning, I began collecting what I could. I took photos through the garage window, noted serial numbers on equipment, and cataloged anything I could read without physically stepping inside. I didn't want to tip them off just yet. Let them keep thinking I was some clueless neighbor who just wanted to fit in. The more relaxed they were, the more they'd slip. That afternoon, Karen sent me a group text, without my permission, naturally, inviting me to the Oak Hills Summer Sips event being held on my front lawn. Apparently, she'd volunteered my space for the HOA's welcome party. "Great way to get to know your neighbors," she wrote, followed by a dozen clapping emojis. I replied with a thumbs up and marked my calendar. After all, it was better to let them build their own gallows. As I sat sipping coffee the next morning, watching HOA volunteers set up wine tables using my electrical outlets and decorating my bushes with fake sunflowers, I couldn't help but feel a strange mix of amusement and anticipation. I'd seen this kind of overreach before, people who treated rules like suggestions and public funds like personal piggy bank. But I'd never had it delivered so neatly to my doorstep, inside my own locked garage. What they didn't know was that I'd already pulled public filings, scanned expense reports, and found enough missing receipts to raise a dozen red flags. Karen had been signing off on everything, from community improvement fees that funded catered lunches, to fake landscaping invoices billed to a company run by her brother-in-law. It was all right there, stacked neatly between bottles of Merlot and a punch bowl labeled "for board members only." I watched her clink glasses and laugh with the board members, wearing a sash that said, "President for life," like this was her suburban kingdom. She gave me a little wave across the lawn and mouthed, "So glad you came." I smiled back, then pulled out my phone and started drafting my preliminary audit report. They had no idea who I was. But by the time I was done, they'd wish they'd never touched my garage. By the time the HOA's wine-soaked gathering on my lawn wound down, I had everything I needed to move forward. I waited until the last balloon was deflated, the last laugh faded into the night, and Karen's army of clipboard-wielding followers waddled home with half-empty bottles of my stolen Pinot. I stood in my front doorway, waved politely, and locked the door. Then I opened my laptop and began preparing their audit like a surgeon sharpening scalpels. This was no longer just an inconvenience. This was an open invitation to dismantle an empire built on arrogance, ignorance, and a complete misunderstanding of who they were messing with. The audit process, under normal circumstances, takes weeks to initiate. But since my superiors had already assigned me the Oak Hills file, and I had first-hand evidence of potential tampering, I flagged it as a high-priority review. It was remarkable how much public documentation was available with just a few keystrokes. The HOA had filed quarterly statements with the city, annual expense reports with the state, and submitted reimbursement claims that were, well, creative, to put it kindly. A $2,700 charge labeled Community Wellness Seminar turned out to be a spa weekend for Karen and her executive board at a resort 2 counties away. Another entry showed $4,000 for seasonal decor, which appeared to have purchased exactly 3 inflatable snowmen and possibly a karaoke machine. The deeper I dug, the more surreal it became. The HOA wasn't just sloppy, they were bold. Emboldened, even. It was as if they believed that by virtue of existing in a wealthy zip code and speaking in confident tones, no one would ever question them. And judging by the lack of any prior oversight, they had been right until now. 3 days after the party, I officially submitted the audit notice to the HOA's listed mailing address and followed up with a phone call that was answered, of course, by Karen herself. I identified myself in full this time. Name, department, badge number, and the purpose of the call. The silence on the other end was so sharp I could almost hear her painted-on smile cracking. "I'm sorry," she finally said, her voice tight and sugary. "There must be some mistake. Why would the state be auditing our little HOA?" I answered plainly. "Random selection and a recent complaint regarding property use. Standard procedure." She recovered quickly, I'll give her that. "Well, we're very organized. Extremely transparent. I'm sure it won't take long." "I agree," I said. "It won't." Later that afternoon, an emergency HOA board meeting was announced. Flyers were shoved into mailboxes, and a group chat I never asked to be part of suddenly lit up with panic. Phrases like "keep calm," "present united front," and "clean up the files" were tossed around like glitter at a toddler's birthday party. Meanwhile, I watched from my porch as Karen and 2 board members wheeled crates out of my garage, visibly sweating and whispering furiously. They didn't know I'd already digitally recorded the contents, scanned receipts, and submitted copies to the audit portal. They were tidying up evidence I had already sealed and timestamped. It was like watching raccoons try to cover up a robbery by rearranging trash bags. 2 days later, I made my first official visit to the HOA's office, which was really just a glorified supply closet behind the community center. Karen greeted me in a pencil skirt and pearls, as if she were expecting a senator. She offered me coffee, which I declined, and led me to a folding chair across from a desk overloaded with 3-ring binders and anxiety. "Everything's right here," she said, gesturing like a magician revealing a disappointing trick. "Every receipt, every record, every meeting minute." I nodded, took out my tablet, and began scanning. It didn't take long to find discrepancies. Dozens of expense entries in the physical binders were missing from the digital versions they had filed. Several reimbursements lacked any backup documentation. One file folder labeled Maintenance Expenses Q3 was filled with menus from a sushi restaurant. When I pointed this out, Karen laughed a little too hard. "Oh, that's just, someone must have filed that in the wrong place. We had a team lunch. All $684 of it?" I asked. "Well, we discussed sprinklers." I said nothing and continued reviewing. By the end of that session, I had documented enough inconsistencies to flag the audit for escalation. What had started as a minor procedural check was rapidly turning into a full financial misconduct case. But Karen, in all her stubborn glory, still didn't seem to grasp the severity. She kept trying to charm her way through it, making snide comments about bureaucrats and offering me cupcakes. She even asked me if I really understood how stressful it is to manage a community full of picky homeowners. "I imagine it's less stressful when you're not misusing funds," I replied without looking up. That evening, I walked through the neighborhood and took in the ironic calm of it all. Families watering their lawns, joggers waving to each other, sprinklers ticking rhythmically along the sidewalk. None of them knew what was coming. They paid their dues on time, followed the paint color guidelines, and assumed the HOA was keeping things tidy. I couldn't wait to show them what had been going on behind closed garages. The next morning, I received an anonymous envelope slid under my door. No name, no return address, just a pile of photocopied receipts and a handwritten note. "Check the landscaping contracts, fake names, no real work done." I recognized the handwriting. It belonged to Dolores, the elderly widow 2 doors down who had once offered me lemon bars and whispered that Karen ran this place like a cult. I cross-referenced the names listed on the contracts and discovered that one of the vendors was registered to an address that didn't exist. Another was linked to a shell company registered in Karen's husband's name. That was the tipping point. I immediately initiated the next phase of the audit, freezing the HOA's operating account pending further investigation. I sent a formal notice to Karen and the board. I knew it would land like a bomb. An hour later, Karen stormed up my walkway, cheeks flushed, sunglasses askew, waving a stack of papers and yelling loud enough for the neighborhood cats to retreat. "You have no right. You're abusing your power. This is harassment." I stayed calm. "You entered my property without permission. You used it to store fraudulent documents. You filed false expenses to the state. This isn't harassment. This is justice." She sputtered, searching for a response, but the words failed her. She stomped off, muttering something about lawsuit. I closed my door and sat down, smiling to myself. What she didn't realize, what none of them realized, was that I wasn't just here to do a job. I was here to clean house. And the garage was only the beginning. Karen didn't show her face for 2 days after the HOA's operating account was frozen, and in that silence, the neighborhood began to shift. Whispers traveled from porch to porch like wildfire. People stopped smiling in the forced way they usually did and started asking real questions. Why were the park lights shut off? Why hadn't the trash service come? Why was the landscaping crew a no-show for the third week in a row? Slowly, the myth of Karen's all-powerful HOA began to crumble. Without access to funds, her well-oiled illusion of control ground to a halt, and residents started seeing just how little had actually been maintained under her reign. Behind the scenes, I kept working. I didn't just want to take down Karen, I wanted to unravel every thread of corruption she'd woven into this place. I began reaching out to former board members, volunteers, and even a few vendors listed on her financial record. One man named Ted, who was supposedly paid $12,000 for driveway crack sealing, laughed for a full minute straight when I asked him about it. "I haven't worked in that area in 10 years, he said. "They must have used my business name to cover something up." When I sent him a copy of the invoice, he confirmed it wasn't even his handwriting. That was more than enough. I submitted the documentation to the state's oversight committee, along with a recommendation for a full forensic audit. At that point, it was out of my hands, but that didn't mean I was finished. Karen had crossed into personal territory the second she stepped into my garage, and I wasn't the type to leave a job half done. That week, I made another visit to the HOA office, which now had a paper sign taped to the door that read, "Closed for renovations." I knocked anyway. After a long pause, the door opened just a crack, and Karen's eye appeared through the gap. She looked like she hadn't slept in days. Her usual precision, coordinated outfit, lipstick that matched her file folders, was gone. She wore an oversized sweatshirt and had a wild look in her eyes. "What do you want now?" she asked, no charm left in her voice. "Access to the digital backups," I said calmly. "They're state property during an audit. We don't have any backups." "Then you won't mind if I bring in a forensic team to clone your hard drives?" She slammed the door before I finished the sentence. I took that as consent. Later that day, the IT department from our office coordinated with local law enforcement to seize HOA-owned electronics under the audit order. When they arrived, half the board members resigned on the spot. A few neighbors watched from their windows as a tech specialist walked out with the HOA's desktop computer wrapped in evidence tape. Someone filmed it. Within hours, the video had hit a local neighborhood gossip page, and then Reddit, where it exploded under the title, "HOA President Freaks Out as State Audit Seizes Computer, Caught Using HOA Funds for Personal Spa Retreats." The comments section was savage. The pressure reached a boiling point. One evening, I received a knock at my door. It was Rick, the HOA's former treasurer. He looked sheepish and nervous. I invited him in. "I didn't know how bad it was," he said, sipping water with shaking hands. "At first, it was just a few reimbursements without receipt. Karen said it was temporary, just until the board had better tracking. Then it was gift cards for volunteer appreciation that she never distributed. Then it was those wine orders. I tried to speak up once, and she told me if I didn't play along, she'd tell everyone I'd been skimming too." "Were you?" I asked. He shook his head quickly. "No. But I didn't stop her either. I told him if he provided a sworn statement and turned over his emails, he might be spared from deeper investigation." He agreed. The next morning, I had a full email chain documenting every internal protest Rick had made, and Karen's threats in return. With that evidence, the state finally filed formal charges: tax fraud, embezzlement, falsifying public records, and unauthorized use of private property. Karen was served at her doorstep, still wearing that same hoodie, her carefully manicured kingdom in total ruin. A sheriff's deputy handed her the notice while a neighbor across the street filmed discreetly from behind a curtain. But perhaps the most satisfying moment came not from the state, but from the residents themselves. Now aware of the chaos Karen had orchestrated, the neighborhood held an emergency town hall. Since the HOA funds were still frozen, they met in a cul-de-sac under string lights and folding chairs. I attended in the back, just listening, while people aired years of grievances they'd been too afraid to voice before. The ridiculous paint code rules. The citations for having a wreath up too early. The time someone got fined for leaving their recycling bin out for 3 extra hours. Dolores, the sweet elderly neighbor who'd tipped me off earlier, stood up and said, "We let fear keep us quiet. That ends tonight." Then someone else said, "Let's vote. We're the members. We have the power." And they did. That night, by unanimous decision, the HOA board was dissolved pending full reformation. Karen was banned from holding any position in the new board. And Dolores was named interim president, which she accepted with a proud smile and a plate of brownies she'd brought, just in case. The next morning, I walked out to check my mail and saw Karen moving out. Boxes stacked in the driveway. Her car loaded with framed inspirational quotes and HOA binders that now served no purpose. She avoided my gaze, but I didn't. I stood there, holding a coffee mug and said, "You could have just knocked and asked permission." She didn't answer. Just slammed the trunk and drove away. The garage she once treated like her personal storage shed now stood empty, clean, and fully under my control. I installed a new biometric lock, and converted half the space into a home gym and the other half into a secure archive for future audit cases. I hung a small sign above the door, "Private property, keep out, yes, even you, Karen." Later that week, I filed my final report. It was over. The audit was complete, the fraud exposed, and the neighborhood free. But even as I closed the case file and submitted it, I couldn't help but think about how close it all came to slipping by unnoticed. How many neighborhoods were just like this one, ruled by miniature tyrants in cardigans who thought they were untouchable. But not this one. Not anymore. And certainly not while I was living in it. The story of Oak Hill's unraveling spread far faster than I expected. Once the audit documents were submitted and the charges made public, the local news picked it up almost instantly. A prim, serious-faced anchor read from the teleprompter while behind her, Karen's photo appeared on screen, smiling at a ribbon-cutting event, completely unaware it would one day be used next to a headline reading, "Local HOA President Under Investigation for Fraud, Embezzlement." The story wasn't just about some HOA power trip gone wrong. It was about the arrogance of unchecked authority and the satisfying collapse that follows when someone finally pushes back. I wasn't the one who made Karen fall. She did that herself. I just gave her a little push off the cliff she'd already been dancing on. Residents were glued to their TVs, phones, and social media feed. For the first time in years, Oak Hills wasn't discussing garden hose lengths or patio furniture colors. They were watching their once untouchable president be named in court documents. One of the most active neighborhood gossip pages changed its banner photo to a screenshot of Karen being handed the court summons. The caption underneath read, "Don't steal wine and lie on your taxes, folks." I didn't post it, but I laughed harder than I had in months. The HOA's former board members started scattering like scared pigeons. The vice president, who'd once stood proudly beside Karen during meetings as her enforcer, claimed he had no idea what was going on and tried to join the reform committee. They politely declined. The secretary, who'd done most of the creative bookkeeping, left town quietly. Moved in with her sister 3 cities over, according to the grapevine. No one missed her. Rick, the ex-treasurer, stayed behind. He was honest, at least, remorseful, ashamed, and willing to clean up the mess he'd helped overlook. Under Dolores's guidance, he became the one trustworthy holdover in the new board. And even though some people still gave him side glances at the mailbox, most understood. He had come forward when it mattered. Karen, on the other hand, wasn't going quietly. Within days of the charges being made public, she'd retained a loud, red-faced attorney who insisted in interviews that she was being targeted by a rogue auditor with a personal vendetta. The fact that I had been personally affected, my garage invaded, my property violated, became their central talking point. They tried to spin the whole audit as a revenge operation. I was accused of abusing power, manufacturing evidence, even trespassing on HOA business. It was laughable. I didn't respond publicly. I didn't need to. Every claim they made collapsed under the weight of paperwork, timestamps, recorded calls, and signed documents. If anything, her outbursts only made things worse. People started calling her GarageGate Karen, and one clever neighbor printed t-shirts with a cartoon of her standing in front of a garage stuffed with wine and shredders. He sold out by the weekend. The investigation didn't stop at Oak Hills. Once my report was reviewed by higher authorities, it led to a chain reaction. The audit revealed that Karen had served on advisory boards in several neighboring HOA. Turns out, Oak Hills wasn't the first place she'd reallocated funds. She'd bounced around communities, leaving behind poorly documented expenses, unfiled permits, and expensive catering bills charged to community morale initiatives. Each one was small enough to escape scrutiny, until they weren't. The state opened a broader inquiry, and Karen's name suddenly appeared in 3 other active cases. Back at Oak Hills, change finally started to feel real. The newly elected board held open meetings, real ones where residents actually got to speak and weren't timed with a buzzer or fined for disruption. The budget was made public. Every dollar accounted for. Dolores stood at the front of the clubhouse with a smile, her stack of cookies beside her, and calmly explained each line item while kids ran around behind her with water balloons. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. And after Karen's dictatorship, honesty felt like a revolution. There was a moment that week that struck me more than anything. I was walking past the community garden Karen had once tried to ban because it clashed with HOA aesthetic uniformity. A group of neighbors were planting herbs together, laughing. A man who'd been fined last year for using the wrong shade of beige on his front door stood holding a shovel next to a woman Karen had once yelled at for having wind chimes. They were building something. Not rules. Not fear. Just community. That was the real punishment for Karen. Not the charges, not the news cameras, not the trial she would inevitably face. Her real punishment was watching the neighborhood thrive without her, realizing that all the control she clung to had only ever been an illusion. But she wasn't finished making noise. A week before the court hearing, she scheduled a press conference. Just herself, her lawyer, and a single local reporter who showed up more out of curiosity than obligation. Karen stood behind a podium borrowed from the community center and read a prepared statement blaming ungrateful residents, state corruption, and me by name for what she called a targeted witch hunt. She even claimed she'd been framed, that someone else must have placed the receipts in her garage, forged the checks, and edited the financial records. Her speech was a spiral. The reporter's article described it as an emotional implosion featuring conspiracy theories, dramatic pauses, and one truly confusing metaphor about HOA leadership being like shepherding wolves. Meanwhile, the state attorney's office calmly filed a response that included scanned signatures, matching timestamps, bank records, and security footage from my home showing Karen and 2 board members entering my garage uninvited. Her press conference did nothing but seal her reputation as the queen of denial. The day of the preliminary court hearing, I didn't need to be there. But I went. I sat in the back row of the small courtroom, just observing. Karen walked in, shoulders stiff, still wearing pearls like she was clinging to whatever dignity she thought she had left. Her lawyer tried to argue for dismissal, citing personal conflict and misconduct. The judge barely let him finish. The evidence was too clear. The trial would proceed. As Karen was let out, she spotted me and paused for half a second. Her eyes didn't hold anger. Not anymore. Just disbelief. Like she still couldn't wrap her head around the fact that this all happened because she thought she could take over a stranger's garage. She had gotten away with so much for so long that the idea of consequences seemed foreign. She gave me one last look, turned away, and disappeared down the hall. I stepped outside into the sun, feeling the kind of satisfaction that doesn't come from revenge, but from justice served with precision. The neighborhood was healing. The illusion was broken. And the garage? It was quiet again. That night, I poured myself a glass of wine, one of the bottles Karen had left behind, and toasted to the simplest truth I knew. When someone shows you who they are, believe them. And if they break into your garage, make sure they never forget what they left behind. Weeks passed, and with each day, Oak Hills began to look a little more like the community everyone had originally signed up for. The constant tension that had once lingered in the air like a storm cloud began to dissipate. The fear of getting fined for a mailbox that wasn't regulation white or a flower pot out of place was gone. People smiled more genuinely. Kids played in front yards without being shushed by clipboard patrols. The weight Karen had placed on this neighborhood, disguised as order and policy, had finally lifted. And in the vacuum she left behind, something unexpected began to grow: actual connection. Dolores led the transition with a quiet strength no one had seen coming. She hosted weekly meetings under a giant tree in the park, made fresh lemonade, and handed out printed budgets with her signature in blue pen at the bottom. Every cent was accounted for. Every question was answered with honesty and patience. Residents were encouraged to participate, not punished for speaking up. The difference was night and day. What had once been a dictatorship of egos was now something closer to a town square. For the first time since moving in, I saw people who had once kept their heads down stand up and speak with confidence. It was a beautiful thing to witness. I received a formal thank you letter from the new HOA board, signed by every member, with a handwritten note from Dolores at the bottom that simply said, "Your garage may have been the battleground, but your courage saved the whole village." I chuckled at that. She had a way with words. Still, I wasn't looking for thanks. Doing my job was one thing. But standing up for what was right when it impacted my home, that was personal. It felt good to know it had meant something. Karen's trial date was set for the following month, and in the meantime, she had gone mostly silent. No more press conferences, no social media rants, not even a peep from her overly aggressive attorney. According to whispers, she had sold her house in a rush, pocketing what she could before potential restitution orders caught up with her. No one knew where she went. Some said Arizona. Others said she moved in with her sister in Florida, but no one cared enough to confirm. Her departure wasn't celebrated with banners or parties, just a collective sigh of relief. Like finally closing a book no one wanted to keep reading. The garage, once ground zero for this absurd saga, had become my sanctuary. I turned it into a hybrid space, a secure workroom on one side with clean shelving, files, backup drives, and a locked cabinet for audit gear. The other half became a compact but solid gym. Pull-up bar, punching bag, bench press. I'd work out at night, music low, garage door open to the breeze. It gave me peace, knowing the space had gone from an unauthorized HOA storage unit to something that finally, truly, belonged to me. I did, however, keep one thing from the old days: a small folding chair. It had been part of Karen's stash, used during their so-called wine summits, and it had her initials written in faded black Sharpie under the seat. I set it up in the corner, untouched, almost like a trophy. A quiet reminder that no matter how powerful someone thinks they are, they're still just another person with bad handwriting and delusions of grandeur. Not long after everything settled down, I was invited to speak at a professional conference for state auditors. They wanted a case study, something engaging, that would highlight the importance of grassroots accountability. I thought about saying no. Public speaking wasn't my favorite thing. But then I pictured the looks on people's faces when I told them the whole thing started with a broken garage lock and a bottle of stolen Pinot. So I went. The room was full, and as I laid out the sequence of events, casual invasion of private property, wine-fueled HOA meetings, forged maintenance invoices, the impromptu garage inspection that turned into a statewide investigation, the crowd was riveted. By the end, people were laughing, shaking their heads, and applauding. One woman came up afterward and said, I'll never look at my HOA the same way again. Back home, Oak Hills was thriving. The pool got cleaned for the first time in months, the broken swing at the playground was repaired, and neighbors started organizing their own events instead of waiting for board approval. Dolores even helped launch a community garden program, something Karen had once dismissed as an eyesore that invites insects. Now it was filled with tomatoes, herbs, and laughter. Even the guy who got fined 3 times for hanging wind chimes? He was in charge of compost. One Saturday morning, I woke up to the sound of kids splashing in the community fountain. Someone had clearly turned it into an unofficial water park, and no one seemed interested in stopping them. I made coffee, stepped outside, and waved to a few neighbors walking by with their dogs. One of them gave me a 2-finger salute and said, "Garage guy." I smiled and nodded. The nickname had stuck more than I thought it would. Later that afternoon, I got a package. No sender listed. Inside was a single sheet of paper and a bottle of wine, the same label I'd seen in my garage all those weeks ago. The note simply said, "You win. But the wine's still good." No signature, but I didn't need one. I placed the bottle on a shelf above my desk, next to a framed copy of the audit report's closing paragraph. The final piece came when I posted about the experience online, just to get it off my chest. I titled the post, "HOA used my garage without permission. They didn't know I'm their new state tax examiner." Within hours, it exploded. Reddit users couldn't get enough. The top comment read, "That's the kind of main character energy we need in local government." Others chimed in with their own HOA horror stories, some even asking how to file audit requests of their own neighborhood. The story spread across platforms, becoming one of those tales that starts as entertainment but ends as a warning. Don't mess with quiet people who know how to file federal forms. In the end, it wasn't just about the garage, or even about Karen. It was about the idea that no one is above accountability. That rules aren't just for other people. That respect for boundaries, both literal and financial, matters. Oak Hills became a better place not because someone enforced fear, but because someone finally said enough. As I closed my laptop that evening, listening to the soft hum of the neighborhood winding down, I realized something simple but profound. The smallest spaces, even a dusty garage, can become the stage for the biggest turnarounds. And sometimes, all it takes to change everything is someone finally telling the truth.